have three very exciting panelists and a lot of questions to ask them, and I'm sure there'll be questions from the audience as well too. So let me welcome everyone to this session offered by the U.S. Women's Caucus at the UN. I am Susan Lee, the president of the U.S. Women's Caucus. And let me just tell you a little bit about who we are as the Women's Caucus. We're a network of US-based NGOs and individuals who are active at the CSW. And we have formed our group a few years ago in order to share information and do joint advocacy. And so we have little by little been building up our network and our capacity and trying to engage with the work of the CSW, as well as the global feminist community that gathers here at the CSW. Anyone who is a US-based individual or NGO is welcome to join us. And our kind of entrance criteria are that they agree with the principles of CEDAW and the Beijing Platform for Action. And we'll put the website in the chat if you want to learn more about us. That will be a way for you to learn more about us if you would like to. Please feel free to put your name and organization in the chat if you'd like to introduce yourselves to others here on the call. So I want to say how pleased I am to be here for this important conversation about gender and climate change. And we're looking especially here at the United States. We could say climate change is, one of the compelling issues of our era, an issue that really threatens the well-being of life here on Earth, and such an important topic to look at it from the point of view of gender, which is really a key to actually addressing climate change effectively. So very happy to be here and to hear from our panelists today. I heard this morning at the US side event that women are hurt first and worst. And I thought that was a great way to kind of sum up some of the challenges for women in climate change. Now, before we begin, I do want to say a few words about what's going on in Ukraine. I think as women of the world gather here at CSW, we can't fail to think of what is happening, so troubled in that beleaguered part of the world. And as the Women's Caucus, we want to affirm, as the US Women's Caucus, we want to affirm our support for the people of Ukraine, especially the women and girls who are at risk, so much at risk, and to stand in solidarity with them as they deal with the unprovoked attack by the Russian Federation. We join with other civil society organizations in calling for an immediate ceasefire, for humanitarian assistance, and for the withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. And so just want to keep our Ukrainian brothers and sisters in our thoughts as we start this session. So I would like to pass the microphone over to our policy director at the caucus, June Marie Justice, who is going to be our moderator today. So June Marie, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here today. It's been an exciting CSW so far, and just incredible insight from so many frontline leaders, grassroots leaders, and just across the board, especially loving all of the Indigenous wisdom and people of color who have just stepped into these spaces, thank goodness, and are just hoping to guide us as we move forward and try to address this unbelievable crises. I just also wanted to add on to what Susan was saying and recognize that, yeah, our solidarity with the Ukrainian people, but that also we would be remiss without recognizing that it's women all over, whether those conflicts are in Ukraine, Ethiopia, Yemen, Myanmar, Afghanistan, that we as a caucus stand in solidarity with our sisters around the globe. Okay, well, today we are honored to be joined by three esteemed climate feminist leaders in the US, Patterson, Katherine Quaid, and Sherry Mitchell. I won't be able to do their extensive bios justice. So to give them as much time as possible to speak, I encourage each of you to return to the events page following this and look at their bios in more depth, or look at the link in the chat. I believe that Kathy Horvitz has placed a link to their bios or more information in the chat. Instead, I will do a brief intro to each and give them as much time as possible to speak. Let's see. So if you have questions, please throw them in the chat. I don't think we have a Q&A on this function on this. So just put all of your questions in the chat and we'll try to curate at the end. So without further ado, let me introduce our first presenter. Jacqui Patterson is the executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project. She fosters Black climate justice leadership. And she was one of the senior directors for she was the senior director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. Jacqui's a public delegate for the United States delegation to the CSW 66. So we're really delighted to have her here. Thank you, Jacqui. Take it away.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you all. And it's also just an honor to share the panel with Sister Sherry and Katherine. So I am just going to a little bit share about the work that around the intersection of gender and climate justice that I've been blessed to be a part of in some way or another. And starting with kind of the path that took me there. My mom was born in the Black Belt in a place called Dublin, Mississippi, and actually I'm in Mississippi right now, so I'm back in Mississippi, and I had one of the first things that I did, the first trip that I took outside when COVID, after being at home for almost 8 months with COVID, with the COVID situation, it was to drive down to where my mom was born in Dublin, Mississippi, and to experience that community that she was in. It's an unincorporated community also called Hobson's Bayou. And she came up to Chicago, where I was born, through the Great Migration, as they call it, which was the migration of African Americans from the South to the North, and post-emancipation. And so when I went down there, I was struck by being in the community and seeing the big cotton field across the street from where she lived, and wondered if her grandparents were out there as enslaved labor, picking that cotton. And I was looking at the mechanized tractors that they were using to harvest the cotton now, and thought about the labor that went into picking that cotton and during that time. And I thought about the fact that women were required to, when they were go into labor, they would go into labor in the field and just be required to just then strap their babies on their backs and continue the labor of picking the cotton. And again, it just was a reflection on the extractive economy and the ways that this place that we now call the United States, the stolen land, how it really was founded on these principles of extraction, of domination, of exploitation of people and land. And so again, I was on the south side of Chicago. I didn't know when I was growing up that with the number of kids that were in my school, in my church with asthma, or the people at the church that had their respirators rolling around, I didn't tie that to what I know now to be the coal-fired power plants, the 3 coal-fired power plants that were within a 30-mile radius of where I live, the near roadway air pollution from the Dan Ryan Expressway that was excessive in our communities, like near roadway air pollution is excessive in so many communities. In the last 10 years, I got to know the work of people like Kimberly Wasserman of the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, otherwise known as LVEJO, who led on shutting down the Fisk and Crawford coal-fired power plants in that community, and the work of the League of Women's Voters in Indianapolis, in Hammond, Indiana, which was right over the state line from where I lived, that shut down the coal-fired power plant in Hammond called the State Line Coal Plant. And so interesting, just kind of all the things that I experienced as a child, even before I was born, and the ties that I'm now seeing around environmental justice, around gender justice as I go on. I was at a meeting of the Extreme Extractive Energy Summit in South Dakota, and listened to the stories of Candy Mossett of the Indigenous Environmental Network at the time, talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women who are along the pipelines or around the man camps in those areas. I'm sure Cheryl will talk more about that. And then fast forward as we think about our energy sector. Today, recently, I was actually we had a session at a UN Commission on the Status of Women meeting where we were talking about the intersections of gender and climate justice. And one of the people who was on the panel was Bernetta Hayes, who was from a place called Port Gibson, again, Mississippi, where they had a nuclear reactor that came online. And again, as we talk about shifting away from fossil fuels that cause so much harm to the planet and to people, then unfortunately, there's a number of people who are saying, oh, let's go with nuclear instead. And so one of the plants was the Grand Gulf Nuclear Station that she lived near. And she talked about how she was 29 years old and how 5 of her classmates have passed away from breast cancer. And it's a cancer cluster that arose around this nuclear reactor that is in Port Gibson, Mississippi. Hurricane Katrina took me back down south after living in Chicago and then living in Boston and so forth. I went down to Houston in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina and worked in the disaster recovery centers and heard the many stories of people who are impacted, with a large degree of people who are impacted being Black, Indigenous, people of color, folks who were affected, and heard the stories of people who experienced violence against women in the aftermath of the disasters. And of course, now doing that work, we see how that's happened after the earthquake in Gujarat, the other disasters, other hurricanes, and so forth. So my dad immigrated to the United States from Jamaica, and I had the fortune of being in the Peace Corps in Jamaica. And when I was there, and experiencing the life there firsthand, is interesting, the kind of difference between experiencing the life that we often see when we see the sandals commercials and so forth, the beaches and so forth, and then actually being in communities that don't get to see the wealth that comes from the extreme wealth that comes from the tourist industry. And while I was there, we started a book club, and one of the books we read was How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And we really learned about the economic system there, the political system there, how it ties to a larger geopolitical system that again extracts from countries in the global south and encloses wealth and power and nations and corporations in the global north. In doing work internationally, I worked with a women's focus group in South Africa where they were talking about the need for female controlled condoms. And the reason that they said that they needed the female controlled condoms was because they wanted the girls who had to walk farther because of the drought to get water every day when their duty is to get water from the water supply. And so they have to walk farther and farther to get water, not only missing time for school, but actually being at risk, such extreme risk for sexual violence that they want their girls to wear female controlled condoms every time they took that walk. One of the most sobering things I heard when I was in doing that work. And then we know those kind of conditions, whether it's the drying up of the lands that make it harder to get water or harder to grow crops, and women and girls are often responsible for the water or for agriculture. I work in a immigrant rights center in Laredo, which is co-run by this woman named Nydia. And time and time again, we met women and girls who were coming through because, again, of the drying up of the lands there. But yet, even though the US is responsible for 4% of the global population, we're responsible for 25% and upwards of the emissions that drive climate change. And yet when people come seeking assistance, we need to make sure that we are not only taking responsibility, but offering safe harbor, because we're also a land of abundance. There's a quote by a Kenyan-born Somali poet where she says, "No one puts their child in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." So in my last 2 minutes, I've been keeping time. I just really want to turn to solutions, because I really wanted to ground us in some of the challenges, but also ground us in the bounty that's found in the solutions that women are leading on. I had a recent conversation with Ever Joyce Wynn, who is leading on some work in sub-Saharan Africa around with this group called Shine, where they're doing microgrids, women-owned microgrids across the continent to make sure that power, literally and figuratively, is in the hands of women in these communities. I work with a center called the Genesee Center for Domestic Violence Prevention and Intervention, where they were working with women who financial insecurity was one of the key places that was key causes of keeping them in those relationships. And we work with them to get a solar installation on their homes, and the women who were residents of the shelter were actually part of doing the solar installations themselves. And so they were then trained by the group Grid Alternatives, Sunrun, to then become solar installers. And since then, all of the women who were in the transitional shelter who had that training are now living independently in their own homes that they're financing through their jobs in solar installing. So these are the kind of stories that give us light and possibility, literally again and figuratively. The work of folks like the Hive Fund for Gender and Climate Justice, led by Melanie Allen and Aaron Rogers and others who are doing similar to doing that work, as well as the Solutions Projects led by Gloria Walton, and the Katali Foundation, led by Wamaka Agbo. These are all really leading on financing women-led work. I'll end with Leah Penniman, who runs the Soul Fire Farm in upstate New York, which is modeling the ways that we can grow our own food locally. While Leah Johns and Jessica Tovar working on locally owned energy. Fatia with the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance is working alongside folks who are really unifying the continent of Africa to push for gender and climate justice. And also Kathy, the sister from the Marshall Islands, who really was a lightning rod for us all at the UN climate talks when she read her poem. So we have to remember the words, the power of the spoken word and the power of culture work to help us to understand and to move us to the action that's needed. So back to you, Jean-Marie. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jacqui. You touched on just a wealth of different intersections that we are hoping to talk about. So we'll definitely circle back, but I am intrigued, fascinated. If you have any of those links or names that you can throw in the chat for us, I know that all of the participants would love to do a little bit more of a deep dive on any of that work and all of that work. So if you could please do so, that would be terrific. Now, Katherine has asked that I forego her bio because she said it will be redundant to what she is going to share. So I am going to immediately turn the mic over to our esteemed colleague, Katherine Quaid. Take it away, Katherine.
Thanks, Jean-Marie. Just wanted to save us as we can. And thank you so much, Jacqui. It's such an honor to always hear your words and the many different stories and solutions you bring in every time you step into a space. And I really appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katherine. I am Paiute, Cayuse, and Nez Perce, a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla and the communications coordinator for the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, WECAN. I was born and raised in Central Oregon. My home stretches from the snow-capped summits of the Cascade Mountains to the palisaded cliffs of the Deschutes River, which flows toward the Nichiwana, which other people call the Columbia River. These have been the homelands of my ancestors since time immemorial. And these lands are a part of me and lie at the core of why I'm committed to climate justice. Since I was little, my family and I would go up to the mountains to pick huckleberries, these small purple berries that are sweet and tart. They only grow wild, and they have been a part of my community's diet and culture for generations. Every summer in the dry August air, we would drive up the dusty forest roads in search of the berry bushes. I would wander through the trees, listening to the woodpeckers, picking berries that were supposed to be saved for the coming year to be shared with loved ones. Inevitably, many of the berries, especially in my youth, that are supposed to be in my basket would end up being sneakily eaten, with the very obvious evidence being my purple stained smile. I treasured these moments where all the pieces of my identity collided. And as I grew into adulthood, I started noticing how this experience started to shift, how these late August days out in the berry patches started getting earlier and earlier, how the blue skies that poked through the forest line would instead be covered, doused in wildfire smoke that would hang heavy and suppress our lungs. This is when I started to connect the dots, to notice how the changing climate, the extending drought that we are still in, the decreasing snowfall, the increasing wildfires, how all of those impacts fueled by climate change were directly impacting and threatening the practices and cultural traditions that my community has carried forward for generations. And sadly, this story is not mine alone. Since European contact, capitalism, colonization, white supremacy, and patriarchy have been working hand in hand to erase Indigenous communities and our traditions through physical violence, violation of Indigenous sovereignty and rights, and destruction of the lands and communities we call home. And these systemic impacts are further compounded by the governments and fossil fuel industries and their financiers that continue to invest trillions in climate chaos. The impacts of both the climate crisis and fossil fuel extraction, which Jackie mentioned, are an extension of the colonial practices and policies that have tried to take our very identities as Indigenous peoples. We see these impacts across the country. For example, in Minnesota, where the controversial Line 3 pipeline, which is now operational, and was opposed by local tribes and Indigenous water protectors, and it still is right now poisoning local aquifers and wild rice beds. I was just reading an article this morning about a new spill that is impacting their local clean water. And in the Gulf South, where Indigenous communities are dealing with rapid land loss and salinization of the soil due to sea level rise, or in rural Indigenous communities like mine along the West Coast that are dealing with worsening and extensive wildfire seasons that make it unbearable to go outside, make it difficult to breathe, and threaten local ecosystems. And these examples and so many more is not only a loss of land, it is a loss of culture, a way of being in reciprocity with the earth that we have practiced for generations and that is threatened by climate change. 80% of the biodiversity left on the earth exists within Indigenous territories, primarily because of our relationship to nature. And so fighting to protect Indigenous sovereignty and rights is important to everyone's future. Studies have noted that Indigenous rights, knowledge, and sovereignty is critical for mitigating climate change and keeping warming below 1.5 degrees pre-industrial levels, which is outlined, in the Paris Climate Agreement and the IPCC reports. Each Indigenous community carries a vast wealth of traditional ecological knowledge on how to live in harmony with the lands they call home. In my community and in many others, women are the ones holding this knowledge and are vital to passing that on to future generations. For me, I see this regularly popping up in my life. I come from a family of strong women raised by my mom, my sisters, my aunties, and my cousins, strong women who have not only taught me these lessons and carry this cultural knowledge forward, but who also inspire me to take action to address these harms against our people and our land, to raise my voice and resist the systems that seek to minimize our power, to think 7 generations ahead, to be resourceful and abundant, and to do everything with intention and a good heart. And this is how I walk into this world feeling really clear about my purpose, using the skills, the knowledge, and privileges I carry to ensure my descendants 7 generations from now will be able to go to those very same forests I did as a child, where I grew up, the back roads that I know by heart. And they can go and they can pick those huckleberries and they can leave with purple mouths and happy hearts, and that tradition carries forward. And as the communications coordinator for WECAN, I have the opportunity to work with women who want the same for their communities. Amazing leaders who are building community-led solutions to the climate crisis and bringing forward just visions for systemic change. In the Gulf South, we are working with Indigenous women and femmes, led by Monique Verdon of the Huma Nation, and their group is working to reestablish old trade routes and networks that strengthen decentralized systems of support, build circular economies, and support local biodiversity, food sovereignty, and stewardship of their traditional territories. In the Tongass up in Alaska, the Tongass rainforest is responsible for holding more than 40% of all carbon stored by the US National Forest. And we collaborate with Indigenous Tlingit women who are working to protect their forest homelands from clear-cut logging and preserving old growth forests, again, for those future generations, as those forests are the backbone of local communities and ecosystems, and again, food sovereignty. WECAN also partners with Indigenous women to facilitate and organize Indigenous women's divestment delegations to meet face-to-face with major banks and demand they stop funding fossil fuel extraction and infrastructure, which violate Indigenous and human rights. And it's a wonderful program that's had so much success getting money out of fossil fuels. And I can link to that after I'm done speaking. But these are only a few of the countless examples. And I think Jacqui actually named a lot of really wonderful other examples around the country and the world where women are leading our communities and our global movements, connecting traditional knowledge and expertise with solutions to the climate crisis. And so again, as more reports come out painting this harrowing picture of what the coming decades will hold, it is clear that now more than ever, we need Indigenous solutions at the forefront. We need intersectional creative approaches and paradigms that hold the complexity of our existence and match the urgency of this moment. Approaches that are grounded in justice and care for each other and the planet. I am honored to share these stories with you. I am honored to follow in the work of brilliant leaders who are giving everything to stop extractive fossil fuel projects, build innovative climate solutions, resist the systems of oppression that put us into this mess, and imagine a healthy and just future for me, for you, for our entire planet. So thank you for spending time with us today. Thank you for listening to me, Katsiaya. Thank you.
Wow, I just feel like I need to take a deep breath after each of you speak because there's so much to absorb, and I really hope we can unpack some of this a little bit further. But definitely, like, really loved your acknowledgement of the complexities, but then also the urgency and just the Indigenous holistic worldview and just how important it is at the grassroots for us to really let individuals who are at the front lines of these issues lead the charge. So thank you for your wisdom. I'm going to turn now to Sherry Mitchell, Winnehamu-Quaset. She is a lawyer and Indigenous rights activist from the Penobscot Indian Reservation in Maine. Sherry is the founder and director of the Land and Peace Foundation, dedicated to the global protection of Indigenous land and water rights. So Sherry, please.
Thank you so much, Jean Marie. And I would just want to take a minute to acknowledge where I come from and introduce you in my own language. So, Ndali Wisi Wanahamukwasut, Denajio Banawapskeli, and Dilnabamakawasus, no Banawapskeli, Nagakakagos, no Tibaik. My name is Sherry Mitchell. My name in my language, Wanahamukwasut. I am from the Penobscot Nation. My family is Bear Clan from the Penobscot Nation and Crow Clan from the Passamaquoddy Tribe of Tibaik. I'm very happy to be able to be here with you and to share this panel with this young woman who's giving me incredible hope, Katherine. It's the first time that I'm having the opportunity to meet you, and I want to thank you for all that you're doing and for your powerful voice. So thank you. And of course, the magnificent Jacqui Patterson. You know, I think about Jacqui Patterson kind of like this magical being who is everywhere and nowhere all at once. She's so quiet. She really pays attention to what's going on. She sits in a room with all of these thought leaders and she's just very quiet over there. And then all of a sudden, when she starts to speak, your mind is blown. She's taken in everything, every single thing that everyone has said, and she's able to come back with this articulation of the issue that really hits the center of it and brings it home. And so I just really appreciate your voice, Jacqui, and it's nice to be able to share space with you again. So when I was asked to be a part of this panel and was asked to think about how have I been impacted by some of these issues related to climate change and how have the people within my territory been impacted, it was easy for me because when I when I'm asked, who am I and where do I come from, I answer with one word, Penawatskewee. And what that means is that the people, the Penobscot people in our traditional language, Penawatskewee, and the water that surrounds the island nation that I come from, it's also Penawatskewee. The land is also Penawatskewee. And so there's no separation between me and the land and those waters. And so when I think about myself in that context and think about how I grew up as part of a riverine culture in the midst of this circle of paper mills that surrounded us, and the way that those paper mills contaminated the waters that surrounded our reservation, as they did so many other places where Indigenous, Black, other people of color, and people who are considered to be rural poor found themselves in these areas where industry backed right up against our backyard and created a lot of this pollution in areas where there were people who they assumed had been forgotten. And so we've had the first impacts. We've been on the front lines of those impacts for decades. And so when I was growing up, I learned how to paddle a canoe before I was able to ride a bike. And one of the things that I was always taught was about our relationship to those waterways and to the islands within that river, and came to understand how deeply connected we were through time to that place. And I was forbidden from being in the water. I could be on the water in a canoe, but I could not be in the water. When I was growing up, there were two things that I was forbidden from doing from my grandfather. And that was swimming in the river because of the level of pollution that was present there, and crossing the bridge where there was an extreme amount of racism against tribal peoples. And so he said, those are the two things that if you choose to do those things, I can't keep you safe. And so, I spent my entire lifetime being taught about who I was, where I come from, how I was connected to the world, my sense of place within this whole sphere of creation, in a way that prohibited me from active engagement with the cultural traditions that I was being told about because of the levels of pollution that were present in our local communities. And then I also was present during the 30 years of work that our tribal nation did with all of our neighbors up and down the river, in building this huge network to clean up the river. And so I remember when I came home, I came back home after I'd been to law school and had a few jobs out in the world that helped me to gain a skill set that I could bring home and help benefit my own people. That when I drove across the bridge that brought me into our community, came up the road a little ways in this big U-Haul, and I had been driving for 5 days, and I had mixed feelings about coming back home, but I knew that it was time, mostly because my kids staged a mutiny and said that they wanted me to be back home. And so I came upon the boat landing, and there were children swimming in the river. And I burst into tears because I knew that it was all of the work that had been initiated by my own people, not because they, stood on some soapbox and demanded a right to clean water, to the subsistence rights that they had been given through the laws of the United States, but because they had a deep sense of responsibility for taking care of the lands and the waters that they were connected to. And to see the progression of that in my lifetime is what brought me to this work of climate change and environmental justice, and looking at all of the inequity that rises up within Indigenous communities, not just in the United States, but across the globe. So we have, as Jacqui alluded to, increased rates of violence in the man camps that surround tribal communities. Just this rampant epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We have environmental illness that, similar to what Jacqui talked about with really rare and aggressive forms of cancer that are supposed to appear 1 in 100,000, being experienced by dozens of people in one small community. Because we were on the front lines of the impacts of climate change, because we were the ones whose lives were considered to be disposable. And so when I think about, the role that women play and the role that women need to be playing in regard to these issues, I think it's really important for us to be very careful not to simply claim that placing women in positions of power is enough. Because if we look around, this fallacy that that's enough has cost us a lot of time. There's a lot of women who are in positions of power and who are operating within a business as usual mindset within the extractive and destructive systems of the current paradigm. And so, women who view the elevation to those positions as markers of success and who don't contemplate that the entire patriarchal system that they are embracing is a failure, and that they have to look at their success in relationship to that failure. So when I think about women being part of this work that is so critical to help heal the planet, what I think we need are fierce mothers and grandmothers and aunties who have the courage to carry heart-based wisdom into the places where decisions are being made. We need women who will demand that this disjointed madness that's separating human action from global consequence be stopped. We need women who will put aside their immediate comfort for our future survival and allow sanity to be restored. This is a movement that calls for a revolution of the heart. And it's those mothers, grandmothers, and aunties at the grassroots level who have been carrying the rhythm of that movement. These are the ones working to stop sources of source point pollution that's causing environmental illness in their children, who are standing up against the pollution of our waters, the ones blowing the whistle on companies that are poisoning and destroying our soils with forever chemicals. Those are the women that we need right now. And when we think about what our role here is, we can talk in very sophisticated academic language. We are capable of giving very clear scientific statistics on what's happening. We can work in equations and we can work with data. But what it comes right down to is being able to capture and to amplify our humanity, which seems to have been lost in the process. And so if we hope to be able to address these changes, these catastrophic changes that are taking place right now on the earth that are so desperately impacting the lives of people in the Arctic, people in the Marshall Islands, and some of the other Pacific Island nations who are experiencing complete loss of their homelands. People who are living in the South in the US who have been faced with one catastrophe after another as a result of increased storm severity and rising sea levels. We are dealing with the consequences of climate change today, which means that we have to start addressing these things today. And we have to let go of the fallacies that have led us to believe that the solutions of our past are going to lead to some type of change that will lead us into the future. And so, just a little bit about what my organization does, the Land Peace Foundation. I'm the founding director of this organization, and we have worked with thousands of scientists, scientific scholars, activists from over 40 countries on how to engage with indigenous ecological knowledge, traditional indigenous knowledge, and how to balance that with this Western science model, and to be able to develop strategies that are in alignment with those who know how to live within and adapt to the environments that they are inhabiting, rather than having those come in and impose those ideas on them. That's one of the main thrusts of our work. We also have been a part of the US ACE framework development for the United States, and working on Indigenous land guardianship with organizations like Neotero, and also partnering with organizations for new ways of being in relationship with those that are being served. Organizations such as Conservation International and Post Carbon Institute, Resilience.org, all of these other groups who are doing phenomenal work out in the world. We've been working with them and helping to train a number of their staff members to engage this work in such a way that's more holistic and less narrow in its ways of knowing. And so I think that's one of the things that people who are part of ethnic minorities have to offer this work is an expansion of thinking, expanded ways of knowing, and expanded ways of being that are actually in alignment with the natural flow of life. And so I'm happy to be able to be here with you and to be able to offer some thoughts on this. And I'll stop there so that we can move into the next set of questions. So Jacqueline, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sherry. What a lot to dive into. We have just an incredible amount of wisdom on this panel. So what I'd like to do is throw out some questions, and some of you, each of you have touched on various threads of this in part of your introduction and your remarks that you've already shared. So, feel free to expound in whatever direction you think is most suitable. But I want to touch back and kind of come around to this idea, no pun intended, of the circular economy. So as we look to create sustainable societies, we recognize the need that we have to move from this extractionism that you've all mentioned, these colonial vestiges that we were living in, and then try to shift to a new paradigm and a new model, which is to create these circular sustainable economies. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that looks like to you, and what does a just transition mean to you, and what does this circular economy look like to you? And I will bounce it back to Jacqui.
Yeah, I'll just give a couple of examples, but the circular economy to me looks like one where just as it's built on principles of regeneration and also of shared wealth, as opposed to the concentration of wealth that we have now. So it looks like an example of a regenerative economy is places like the Earthseed permaculture farm, and where the community is coming together to grow and work the land together. They're working in harmony with the land and not over extracting from the land. There's a intention about being kind to the land and ensuring that we're not using pesticides that are harmful and so forth, and that it creates jobs for the community and ensures that everyone in the community has access to healthy and nutritious diets and so forth, and it does so in a way that again, the earth produces, the seeds go back to the land and then continue to produce. And that again, there's that regenerative nature and the harmonious harmonious nature of the relationship. So I'll just give that as one example.
Perfect. Katherine, would you like to share your view of what this looks like and what a just transition might look like?
Yeah, I think
examples you've seen where there's been successes, which I appreciate, Jacqui, you keep coming back to all of these models of like, okay, what's working? Because I think that's what we're all really here for, is right. Let's figure out what is working and how do we continue to push that forward?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Jacqui. I think just expanding on kind of what you said of I think similarly for me, regeneration is definitely a part of looking at a just transition, as well as restoration and justice, and really looking at the larger picture, like understanding that climate change is kind of the water that we're in, and we have a lot of work to do in terms of societal changes, in terms of, instituting what abolition looks like, in terms of Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty, and gender reproductive rights, and all of these different areas that I actually feel are very interwoven and interconnected. And when we talk about a just transition, for me, it means kind of building the best visions that we are all carrying for the world we want to see. And for me, that really looks like having deep conversations with my friends who work on abolition work, and figuring out how we're going to scale it. If we got 10 years in climate, for protecting our climate, how are we also addressing abolition within that? Because we are both organizers and love making timelines and to-do lists. So I think there are, small examples of that, of how it's kind of being interwoven in terms of what is being addressed, and really going again, amplify. Sherry said, amplify our humanity. And I think that is, I wrote it down on my little notes here because I think that's it. People are not disposable. Land is not disposable. And right now that is what is guiding our economies, is guiding how we treat people in this world, not only in the US, but globally, right, of these sacrifice zones and sacrifice communities. And so really pushing forward to acknowledge everyone's humanity, and to build systems of care and replenishment that reflect that. And I think Jacqui gave a lot of great examples. I think at a national level, Bhutan has tried to do some of this, right? They have the gross national happiness levels, and you can kind of look into how that's been going with them. We've done a few feminist economies webinars at WECAN, where we have this really wonderful leader of that work joining us. So I think there's things like that, in some ways we do a lot of policy work. I also work at the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition, and we do a lot in terms of looking at what are care jobs and what are green jobs, and how we're bringing those together, and how can we understand, especially within the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think we are still in, we are still moving through that. It is not over. How do we understand how healthcare and the jobs that are predominantly done by women for caregiving in our society are integral to a just transition? And I think the National Domestic Workers Alliance has a lot of great examples of that. So I'm going to leave it there. Those are just a few of my thoughts as we're going along, and give it back to you.
Great. Yeah, I love that you've each kind of indicated or pointed to this sort of where I find ourselves at some kind of an inflection point, where these movements are hopefully coming together to strengthen one another. And this movement for justice is really necessitates us stepping back and looking more holistically at kind of how we got here, and making sure that those who were most marginalized are the ones that are most, I guess, rewarded by this just transition. So let's kind of keep going in this direction. And Sherry, if you could share some thoughts on your idea of what this looks like and what a just transition means to you, I would appreciate it.
Thank you to Jacqui and to Katherine for what you've shared. And I think that one of the challenges that we have is that so many of these terms that really are, circular way of being. It's an indigenous way of life, what we call Skijinawe B'Masawagan. It's this way of being in relationship with life. And now we see that this adoption of that term and the transformation of it into an economic model. And so one of the things that we have to be very, very aware of, and we have to start being really honest with ourselves, I think, because time has run out for us to believe in fairy tales, that, circular economies is something that's trending right now. And It's being viewed by some with this kind of religious fervor, right, as the solution for the problems of our time, for this consumption, overconsumption, and degradation of the planet. And it's captured enough attention for there to be businesses and organizations that are cropping up now to meet the anticipatory demands of the developing metabolic models of circularity that are starting to emerge. And so when we're talking about circular economies, we have to really have a bit of caution at the co-opting of the language, that it's now being turned into a marketplace solution. And so some of the challenges with the co-opting of that language and turning it into something that it's not is that, there is this attempt to sail the notion of the creation of these closed self-sustaining systems as found in nature, but there are no closed systems in nature, right? And so when we start to think about how we are supposed to be aligning ourselves with, excuse me, this way of being in alignment with the natural world, excuse me, and we're basing it on a model that is outside of that scope of reality, where we're using things. I think we're going to get into this later. At least this is one of the things I hope we get into, which is looking at false solutions to climate change. But when we start to think about closed systems, what happens is our minds close down. And we stop thinking about ourselves in relation to the rest of the living systems that live within this larger sphere of life that we're connected to. So some of the challenges with this is that it fails to recognize that natural order, but also there's this theory that these things are based on these notions of urban metabolism. And so when we think about urban metabolism becoming the metric, right, that this becomes the measure of the inflow and the outflow, that it's an equation that it doesn't take into consideration issues of inequitable distribution, which currently frame the reality of extremes between gluttony and starvation that we're facing in the world already. And so if we're using these urban metabolism measures, which looks like the direction that the powers that be are pushing this in, then those who have been left out of the system are going to remain outside of the system. They're going to remain outside of the scope of survival that's being imagined within these circular economies. Some of the other challenges with them is this factor of timelines of proposed solutions. And when we think about recapture, renewal, reintroduction, recycling, there has to be a usable time frame, right? Within this circular system, there has to be a usable time frame for those things that are living within the system. And so when you start talking about nuclear energy, the timeline for that to be usable or to stop being of harm doesn't exist for many lifetimes, right? It's not something that can be factored into a short timeline, and certainly not even within a human lifespan. And so it also has, the potential for catastrophic harm, and we're seeing how it's being weaponized right now in Ukraine. And so, when we're thinking about the development of these things, and we're thinking about, everything is going to be utopian, we're also not thinking about the incredible amount of energy it requires to actually recycle products. And so one of the challenges, I think, is that if we were to look at this as like a purely metabolic equation, right? How many fad diets have any of us ever been on? I've been on a few. I have to admit it, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And every fad diet always leads to the same outcome. You do the fad diet, you stop doing the fad diet, you're right back where you were within a few months of where you started, right? Because the tricks don't work. The simple calories in, calories out equation and being able to add exercise and lifestyle change is what works. And so when we're thinking about metabolism in this mechanized way in relation to development of a circular economy, lifestyle change has to be at the heart of this, right? We have to stop living with this belief that endless expansion is sustainable. It doesn't matter what kind of word we throw around it. If we call it a Green New Deal, if we call it a circular economy, it doesn't matter what we call it. If we continue living the way that we're living, we're not going to be able to survive into the future because we are over consuming and we are over degrading the planet. So, we're consuming faster than the earth can produce, and we are degrading the earth faster than she can heal. And so at the core of all of this is being willing to change the way that we're living, being willing to realize that, some people are never going to get their piece of this pie because the pie is gone. And so we have to learn how to live with less. We have to learn how to stop our lives of excess. We have to stop thinking that we're going to be able to match the energy consumption that our predecessors had. And if we think about the span of human history, most of human history was without electricity or other forms of power, right? And we get upset if the power goes out for 30 minutes. And so how do we begin to start getting over ourselves and start realizing the time that we are living in is one of contraction, and that this time of expansion has to stop. It's an in-breath, out-breath equation. We can only expand for so long before we have to exhale and start to contract, right? And that whole way of life that's lived in relationship with reciprocal sharing that I grew up with is part of that equation. So I could go on for days, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Wow, appreciate your perspective on that. And since we are speaking about this whole idea of, false narratives and false solutions, I would love to just have Jacqui and Katherine weigh in on that as well. And I know we have a lot of other questions we want to get to, but I know that these are points that are really hit home for each of us, or especially each of you. Sorry, go ahead, Jacqui.
No, I was going to say Katherine.
Okay, go ahead, Katherine.
I'm like, Jacqui, you can go. I could just touch on this a little bit, and I think Sherry shared really, I appreciate you really bringing up co-option, because this is what false solutions are. This is what net zero is. It is a co-option of and kind of a putting our solutions into a capitalist model and pretending like it's going to do something, when capitalism is one of the root causes of the climate crisis, and is again offering extraction and empty promises. I think, I was at COP26 last year, and we saw this everywhere. We saw all the governments talking about net zero. We saw all the financial institutions signing agreements and, pacts and all these things that say, oh, we're going to get net zero by 2050. Net zero is, again, it's just some random, it's calculations they all made up. It's not based into what is really happening on Earth. It is not going to resolve that. To 2050, too late. We can just leave it there for that one. Yes, greenwashing. And, they even go so far as to talk about nature-based solutions and carbon offsets, which again, just lead to further fossil fuel extraction. It's fossil fuel companies saying, I'm protecting, this swath of Amazon, forest lands, which I kicked all the indigenous peoples out of and might catch on fire soon, but who cares? Now I can, go extract fossil fuels in Richmond, California. So I think Again, yes, distraction from extraction. That's a great tagline, June Marie. And so I think these just don't work. They very clearly don't work. They have been around since, I think, the Kyoto Principle, carbon offset market mechanisms, and they've had 20 years to figure it out and to prove that they do work, and they don't. So that's just, it's very clear to me, and it's very upsetting that governments and corporations continue to peddle these narratives like they really mean anything. And a part of my, I'm actually more of an internal worker, I should say. And so a part of my work is doing a lot of research on reports that do just this. I'd be happy to send 10 your way that have looked into, fossil fuel companies that have looked into investments, and it just doesn't work. And alternatively, these solutions still perpetuate violations of Indigenous and human rights. They still push Indigenous peoples off their land. They still violate free, prior, and informed consent, which is a very important right that's outlined in the UN principles on Indigenous peoples, and is also a part of the UN, is the main theme of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues this year. And so again, these aren't actually getting to the root causes, and they're not bringing transformative solutions that would actually bring forward, again, that paradigm shift that is needed, that lifestyle change, that cultural change that really needs to happen. These are just solutions that are fitting into a capitalist box and letting rich people get richer still. And everyone else is seen as disposable and suffering, and we're all just little pieces in their larger narrative. So I'm mad about false solutions. I like to wail on all about it, but I'll pass it to Jackie and Sherry.
Jackie, do you want to jump in on that, or do you want me to go on to the next question?
You could go on to the next question. I think Katherine did that very thoroughly. Yes, so thank you. You can do that. Do you want? Is that okay? Are you going to the next one? Okay, sorry.
Sorry, I accidentally muted myself.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.
So you've talked, Jackie, a little bit about how the extractive economy affected your communities at the grassroots. I'm hoping that you can just touch on why climate impacts are disproportionately impacting women of color in the US, and what are some of the impacts in particular? I know you've done some research and you have a lot of experience around the high Black maternal mortality rate and reproductive health. So have you seen any solutions, and where are we on that?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so, right. I think we've laid out the challenge as well. And the solutions really are found in just transition and shifting away from an extractive economy, because that's at the root of the challenge. And so there's the things that we've been able to, the communities have been able to do at the micro level, at the community level and so forth, that have been moved things along, creating these microcosms of circularity and of regeneration and of cooperation and so forth. And that's great. And we need to move that to scale in terms of a societal shift away from these practices that are harming. And so the ways that we shift to more local economies in terms of whether it's the means of production are closer to the means of the place of consumption. These kind of the principles and practices that we need to shift towards, so that we don't have these large factories that are belching out these toxins that are getting into our bodies, so that we shift away from the mass production and processing that is creating the greenhouse gas emissions that are resulting in the disasters that are putting people in harm's way, disproportionately women, as it relates to violence against women. If we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by making the shift from an extractive economy, then we have, and then also, even as we talk about, we see, even whether it's hate crimes or other types of conflicts that we see happening, that so much of it, or a decent amount of it, is this notion of kind of the ways that the powers of be have convinced people that there's a scarcity that actually isn't there. And so again, and so people feel that fear of with this language around replacements when it comes to immigration, like this notion of there's not enough to go around, and therefore I need to resist the other, or I need to oppress the other. And so if we actually recognize the abundance, if we actually leaned into the regenerative nature of our ecosystem and our earth, then we can recognize that we can all thrive. We don't have to have some people suffering in order for others to be well. And we don't have to see the existence of other people to be a threat to our well-being. And so these are the kinds of shifts that we need to make, large scale shifts if we actually want to see gender justice, if we actually want to see immigration rights, if we actually want to see racial justice, or any of these very interconnected forms of oppression. So yeah, so I don't know, those aren't necessarily things that people can walk out of the session and do tomorrow, but it is the direction we need to row in. And in the meantime, we've talked about some of the solutions that people have been able to do at the local level to start to get us in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it keeps coming back to this this more holistic view of our systems and pushing back on the entrenched systems that we're still dealing with. And I think you've each mentioned it, and I know Sherry, you said about kind of stepping into these systems that we recognize as being broken and then trying to affect the change from within these broken systems. It's really challenging, which is why the work on transformative change is so important, and I appreciate what you're doing in that regard. Okay, so question I have for each of you, is if you could just comment on the funding for climate adaptation and mitigation. I mean, we know it comes down to funding so often. So how can funding be directed more effectively towards solutions, especially those affecting women in racially marginalized groups? So who would like to start with that? Sherry, go.
All right, I can sum this up for the United States in a few words. The start would be to put back all iterations of race into Justice 40, because the stripping of all racial identifiers from Justice 40 does exactly the opposite of what it claims to do. And we have seen this. We've seen this happening across the board. We first saw all language identifying Indigenous peoples removed from Article 6. And then we saw the stripping of human rights language from the Paris Agreement. And now in the United States, we're seeing the elimination of all language associated with race being stripped out of Justice 40, which makes the whole justice part of that a joke, because then it just skims over the surface. That's like saying, I'm not racist, I don't see color. If you don't see color, then you're missing a whole lot of people that are standing in front of you. And so when we're dealing with some of these issues, and we're thinking about what's supposed to be the climate solution for on the ground support for people who are facing climate change issues, immediate climate change issues, and who are working on the most accessible adaptation and mitigation practices, and stripping away the communities who are most impacted by that, so that the money set aside for this grand scheme ends up in the same hands that it's always ended up in, and the people who need it the most are again made invisible through the process. So I'll just start that conversation out there, because we are already after the hour, and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So that's my 2 cents worth on that.
Great, thank you. And then would either of you care to comment on that? And if so, would you just kind of expound a bit on Justice 40, just for context for some of our listeners? Jacqui, go for it.
No, actually, I wasn't saying anything. Actually, something bit me. But I'll explain Justice 40, and then let Katherine speak. I'll just explain. Yeah. So Justice 40 is a federal program, and the idea is that it's mandating that 40% of infrastructure spending needs to go to quote unquote disadvantaged communities. And so there is a lot of conversation around Justice 40 and how it can be used to start to correct some of the injustices. But as was stated, there was a recent kind of political move that resulted in it being in it. Before it had an indication of an acknowledgement of the racial lines of these disadvantages and of disparities, and now all the language that would enable folks to really level the scales along the racial justice lines have been removed altogether, and so that's what Sherry was referring to. So thank you. I'll hand it to Kathy.
It's so relevant too for us at CSW because it's the very fight that we find ourselves in around these negotiations. It's like, you know, what is the language that's essential to making sure we keep in? So really appreciate your insight on that. Katherine, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think I can't offer too much in terms of Justice 40, which has already been covered, and agree with both what Sherry and Jacqui mentioned. But, you know, I think whether, you know, you've heard this stat or not, women working at the nexus of gender and climate are only receiving 0.2% of all philanthropic dollars. That's not even a whole percent, that's just 0.2. And we do a lot. I'm sure all of us know we do a lot, and there's a lot of people we know who do a lot with very little in terms of monetary funding to implement our programs and our solutions and do our advocacy work. And quite frankly, the sector of philanthropy has had an issue with these same root causes again. Where did they get that wealth? That wealth came from stealing the land. It came from exploiting people. And that's in our government, that's in the private sector. You can follow the money as far as it goes and where it originated from. And so I think there is a reckoning that needs to happen in really discussing what reparations looks like, what, you know, if you own land, what it looks like to give that back, what it looks like to reframe how we give out money, not as hoarding wealth in these large endowments for the end of the world, right? Like what in perpetuity. I worked in a foundation. That was one of my first jobs. I worked at a racial justice foundation. We were a nonprofit. We did participatory grant making. We gave all of our money away. Like that was the goal, because what are we doing with these large endowments that people really need right now? There's so much wealth hoarded by institutions, you know, academic institutions, by philanthropists, by our government, for safekeeping or for some reason in perpetuity. And what we need right now is that funding to our grassroots organizers and organizations, because they are already making the change on so little. And again, just imagining what could happen if they were able to be well funded, what could happen if we could have actual healthcare for grassroots community organizers, what could happen if we kind of flipped that, whatever, 10% admin kind of pie chart structure that foundations are always looking for. You know, there's so much wealth hoarded by a few people and a few foundations, and it just needs to be redistributed. I think that's very simple to me, and personally, and that participatory grant making again is kind of a hot, you know, I think it's a keyword or what do we call it, a buzzword these days, but we really do need that. And again, I have participated in that, and it's important to have the people who are on the ground, who know what they need, who know what resources they need, to be the ones making the decisions and guiding the strategy as well. And I think that's what participatory grant making offers. And again, it's just wealth redistribution and acknowledging that we live in a capitalist, patriarchal, white supremacist, colonial society, and that impacts every single thing we're talking about, and that impacts foundations and how grants are made as well. Thanks.
Very valid key point. Thank you for sharing about that. As we're looking at these complex issues and the fact that these systems are replicating themselves, and we're trying to, like, you know, deal with the patriarchy and deal with the racism and all of that. I do appreciate you touching on participatory grant making, because for those of you who don't know, it's an opportunity for those at the grassroots to inform the decisions on how the money is spent, because they're the closest to the problem. So I appreciate you touching on that. I want to encourage anyone on the call to please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. And I think we have a couple popping up already. And before I shift to them, I'm going to throw one more question out there. And I know, Katherine, you had mentioned that you would like to share a little bit about policy. And we recognize that in the United States, there's no chance that the US would support a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. But should there be a movement at the grassroots level for cities and counties to commit to such? And then what about the private sector? I know we've touched on the private sector and it's always a slippery slope. How do we create that kind of, how do we create better transparency within the private sector when there's all this money working at odds and against us? So it's a big question. If you want to just touch on it, and then we'll shift over to Q&A.
Great, thanks, Jean Marie. I can just briefly touch on both of those topics. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is, for those who don't know it, is kind of exactly what it says. It's a global treaty campaign to stop the proliferation of fossil fuels and get governments to really to sign that treaty, and is I think inspired and modeled after the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think actually one of the strengths of the campaign for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is that there is grassroots level advocacy and organizing to get cities to commit to the treaty. There are 42 cities and subnational governments that have already endorsed the treaty, and that includes Los Angeles. And of course, this is just in this has just been started to get going. But I think, for that national change, again, this is kind of just looking at the history of organizing. For national change, we need grassroots change, and we need grassroots support and grassroots base building. So I think actually that treaty is being effective in that way. And I don't know if the US will ever support one, but I think we are building the power to get there. And I think, one of those examples is the Rights of Nature movement, where Ecuador included the Rights of Nature which is a legal framework to protect the rights of nature and kind of codify it into law. That's included in the Ecuadorian constitution, and was also used recently to protect indigenous territories from a fossil fuel project moving forward. So I think, again, that's an example where we saw a lot of grassroots effort to engage rights of nature in a national sphere, again, led predominantly by indigenous leadership in Ecuador. And they secured that, they codified it into law, and now they're able to use that to protect their territories and rights. And so I think it's not a top-down method. It's a graph. It's building at the base and going forward from there. And I think that's always a successful solution. So I'll just leave it at that. I couldn't remember the second thing you said.
Okay, so would either Jackie or Sherry like to comment on the private sector involvement in this sort of fossil fuel, kind of not that they would be able to sign on particularly to that treaty, but some have come up with their own mechanisms. And I'm wondering if you had any observations on that, or any situations where you've seen that have been successful to engage the private sector. Did you have a comment, either of you, on that? Or just go ahead.
I think that that's what we need to be doing. And I don't think that there are enough good examples of it, but some of the things that people are doing are, looking at creating local energy grids and moving them all to renewables. And so, that's a big project. I mean, we're running out of time, so I don't want to get too much into it, but that's really where it's at. That's where our best hope lies, I think, is with individual citizens working collectively and engaging the private sector in ways that they will actually be inspired, finding that convergence point, right? That interest convergence point that will inspire them to action, right? Because we know that none of the things that are allegedly great successes in the past, like, let's talk about Abe Lincoln, right? signs the Emancipation Proclamation, and 5 days later is responsible for the biggest mass hanging of Indigenous peoples, right? The man didn't have a change of heart. The man had political pressure that made it no longer viable for him to continue in the way that he was continuing in regard to the slave situation, right? And so what we need to do is look for those interest convergence points that allow that kind of pressure to be applied in such a way that it inspires them to move, and to show them that it's no longer going to be in their beneficial interest to continue to conduct business in the same ways that they have in the past.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to turn it over to some questions from the audience. And I know Kay had a question. Did you want to unmute, Kay? And raise your hand if, feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, or put it in the chat.
This goes back in the conversation quite a ways. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are, Kay. Go ahead.
Back to when we were talking about regenerative agriculture. I have seen various Department of Agriculture and other major promotional film from industrialized agriculture talking about feeding the world and how essential it is to have these mega approaches to agriculture, industrialized agriculture, that regenerative agriculture will just never be big enough to feed the world. I'd like some comment on that.
There's a wonderful film called Kiss the Ground.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it talks about regenerative agriculture, but also talks about the desertification of our soil, the stripping of nutrients. Big ag is responsible for the destruction of our soil, the limitation of nutrients within the foods that we're eating right now. And it has proven over the past 50 years that it's also not sufficient to feed the world, that we actually, have hunger in places where hunger didn't exist in the past because of the destruction of territory and habitat and arable soil. And so there are plenty of examples where restorative agriculture and regenerative agriculture is far more beneficial than big industrial agriculture. The name of the film again is Kiss the Ground.
It's a wonderful film, and I wish we could put it in every household. But the message from the Department of Agriculture and so forth just isn't there. And I'm trying to figure out that interest convergence point, how that gets around where we can start to change. What is it, speed and scale? It's a matter of speed and scale as to how we scale up regenerative agriculture and the speed at which we do it.
Thank you, Kay. So there was a question in the chat about blue washing. Would anyone care to expound on that? Let's see, what is it? I believe you may have mentioned it, Sherry.
I'll just mention what it is and let Katherine and Jacqui comment on it, because once they know, they're going to know. So it's the practice of overselling one's commitment to social justice or, other practices that seem to be far more humane. So it's just this predatory practice of saying, oh, we really care about this issue, when actually they don't really care about the issue. They're concerned about the issue as a marketing ploy, essentially.
Thanks, Sherry. That was a new to me term. Just learning things today. And I think, I think you actually nailed it. It's a marketing scheme. We see it, every month, right? It's Women's History Month now. It was Black History Month last month, in February. And we get these graphics on social media, and we get, this marketing scheme to make us believe that corporations care about us. Corporations are not people. They're made of people who may or may not have our best interests, but again, accepting everyone's humanity. They are people, and corporations are not. They're out to seek and gain money and power and wealth. And so, quite honestly, I don't believe a lot of them. And I think it's just, again, it's not, we want to celebrate all the different ways that we're making progress, but not at the expense of other communities. And I think that's where, again, this looking holistically at a just transition or how we're making change. I don't want to have a solar grid that or have solar energy that violates the rights of the indigenous peoples where I live. That's not the type of solar I'm looking for, right? So I think there's a way to really consider the type of balance that we're bringing forward into a world that we're kind of trying to create, and that it's not at the expense of other people, which is honestly what the majority of corporations are doing. And it's just, yeah, I'm just sorry. It's just someone shared a link about what blue washing was, so I was reading through it, and I think it's again up to us to really develop that political pressure for corporations and governments to do the right thing, because they won't do it unless it no longer serves the bottom line. And blue washing is a part of that, right? We're building the political pressure to say, this matters to us, and now corporations are trying to figure out what they can do about that without changing the entire structure of how they make money and destroy the planet. That's my hot take. Jacqui?
Thank you. So we just are coming to the end of our time, which is such a shame, but I want to give you each an opportunity to just leave our guests with, just a word of thought that you would like each person to take away from today's conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Jacqui, and Jacqui, if you wanted to add a couple, a few minutes on your responding to the prior question, go for it.
Yeah, no, I'll just say that the only thing I was going to say is to give an example of someone called to ask us to participate in a roundtable kind of strategy group. And they were talking about, how do we make this transition and so forth. And then at the end, they mentioned that the people who were putting it together were the American Petroleum Institute. and so I'm just like, yeah, that's a non-starter. Like the only recommendation, like I can just tell you the one recommendation, and that's cease and desist. Like there's no way that you can be better. Like, your entire thing is wrong. And so, but that to that end, I would leave folks with the need for us to delink money and politics. We're living in a corporatocracy at this point, with whether it's the legislatures, the courts, the local governments in too many cases, although not all cases, and even state legislatures and federal systems. There's just outsized, and in the United Nations, as we know, people call it the Conference of Polluters, and so, or the Conference of Profiteers, because of the in terms of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change meetings, not the UN CSW, never the UN CSW, but the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, because of the corporate takeover that's happened there. So we need to make sure that we are delinking money and politics at all levels. So that would be the thing I would leave us with. Thank you.
Awesome. Sherry or Katherine, who wants to jump in next?
I'll just go really quickly because I think Sherry will probably have some cool things to say. But I think just what I want to leave with is really, I shared in my speech that I'm grounded into this land. This land is a part of me, and I hope, and that I think a critical part of the structures that we live in is seeking to erase the complexity of who we are and where we come from and how we're connected to the places we live, to the people we're around, to the people that exist in this entire world, and all the plants and the animals that make this world majestic and abundant and beautiful. And I think just considering what your role is in that, and considering what you need to learn as well. I think I do our media and communication, so I notice this a lot of like, there is so many memes and graphics trying to detail really complex issues. And I think for me, it is taking that and learning more. It's taking that and being like, what books do I need to read about this? Who do I need to talk to? Who do I need to strategize with to really learn and consider how I am making my way in this world and how I can, Sherry actually brought it up, how can I be a good auntie? How can I make it better for my little cousins who are just starting school and, you know, have all of the possibilities ahead? And what am I doing not only on climate, but on all these other issue areas to really make sure that I'm bringing forward a vision of the world that is inclusive of the people I love and the communities I call home. So those are my words. Thank you. Thanks everybody. I'm so honored to be here.
Thank you, Catherine. Oh, all right. And Sherry, would you like to leave us with a parting thought?
I would, if you will indulge me, I would like to, you can be the first to hear a passage from the manuscript of my newest book. I would like to read this as we go out. Okay. We have run out of time for deceptive games. It is time to surrender the illusion that freedom and equality will be found within the patriarchy or under the umbrella of capitalism. To reach our uncertain future, we must disentangle our lives from the systems and structures that have led us to the brink of destruction. We must take a step back from the way of life that is strangling Mother Earth and begin to exhale the glut of air that we have taken in so that the rest of the living world can breathe. So how do we do this? How do we move ourselves away from this divisive and destructive path and move toward a path that has the potential to take us to a place we have never been, a place where the sacredness of all living beings is honored? We begin by moving ourselves out of the center and placing ourselves back into proper balance with the rest of life. The journey begins by acknowledging that our species is not above other living beings. We are co-equals in this equation of life, and our well-being is inextricably tied to the well-being of all other wild creatures. So in this moment, we have a choice. We can either follow civilization to its end, or we can break free from our bondage and rise wild. And so that's what I would leave you with. I would leave you with the challenge to rise wild, to break free from the systems and the structures that have led us to this point of destruction, and to have the courage to exist outside of that created reality, and to dare to dream into being a new reality that allows for the continuation of life. So, Kachi Wiliwan, and I say Pasilda and Alabama, thank you so much. And I offered all of the words here that we have shared today for all of my relations.
Deep gratitude for leaving us the parting words. I have chills, and each of your inspiring thoughts are going to stay with me, and hopefully with each of us, I'm sure they will. So with that, onwards, and thank you again for the great work you're doing.
Thank you all, and how about a round of applause for our wonderful panelists, really, a wonderful, powerful analysis of what's going on, and emphasis on the spiritual part of it too, need to live in harmony with the land, and Sherry's lovely last words with us. So thank you all. We'll stay on the Zoom just a few more minutes if any of you would like to stay and chat, and thank you very much to our panelists for joining us. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you,
Thank you all.
Sherry, share your book in the chat if you have. Is your book out yet?
It's not out yet. No, I'm just finishing the final edits on it right now. So you're the first ones to hear it. So
That passage was on point.
Thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here.
Bye. Thank you.
Good job, you guys.